going to start in about a minute, so wrap up your good conversations this morning. Darrel, that's a little hot. First it doesn't work, and then it's too loud. By the way, Darrel is starting this morning, so I'm just standing up here looking pretty and not doing a very good job of it, I don't think. Yeah.
Check 1, 2. There we go. All right, good morning, church. It's good to see everybody. I'm excited about our new deacons that are coming in. I also want to mention we have one lone deacon right now that's been holding down the fort. James Morris is head of our finances and has a great committee helping him. So we're going to have 8 great deacons, and I'm really excited about that. We probably could have 30, but this is a good start. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to open up to 2 Samuel chapter 7. If you haven't been with us because you've been spring breaking or whatever you've been doing, we've been talking about the covenant journey that we see throughout Scripture. And we started with the argument that although the word covenant is not used, God is putting together this covenant relationship with Adam and Eve in the garden. And after that, we move on to Abraham, and we see the covenant that's made with him. They cut a covenant. God stands in the blood and says, if I don't do what I tell you I will do, may it be my blood that you stand in. And then we go to Sinai, and we talked about the 10 Commandments, specifically on Sinai. And then last week, we talked about the covenant as it relates to the Book of Deuteronomy. And I mentioned how important of a book it is. It's not a flyover book, right? It's not a flyover book, but it's something that we need to read because Jesus quotes Deuteronomy more than any other book in the Old Testament. And when he was tempted in the wilderness, he uses 3 verses to refute the devil's temptations, and they all come from the book of Deuteronomy, right? So it's important to know the law. It's important to know the covenant that comes from there. But today we want to go to David because God is going to make a big promise to David. Now keep it in mind, this is kind of a continuation of all these things. What are the promises that God made to Abraham? Okay, your descendants will be numerous, and what else? What's he going to do with those descendants? They'll be made into a great nation, right? So God makes Israel into a nation at Sinai, but now we see the continuation, or how there's going to be a continuation coming. But just to kind of get us on board here, we're kind of going through the whole Bible as we look at this covenant journey, at least through the Old Testament. So after Deuteronomy, what happens? They go into the Promised Land. And then we get into the time of Judges. And after Judges, we come to this time of 1 and 2 Samuel, where we're going to see a king come into place. So in 2 Samuel chapter 6 and 7, we have a lot of things happening at the beginning of 1 Samuel. But one of the things the elders of Israel are going to do, they're going to go to Samuel and ask for a king. Now, is it wrong for them to ask for a king? I've gone back and forth on this. It's kind of like when you say, is money evil? What do you say to that question? No, it's the love of money that's the root of all evil, right? So you kind of have to do that with this, because it's not, when you read and it says that they asked for a king, asking for a king was not wrong. It was asking for a king like all the other nations that makes it wrong. Okay, it says they wanted a king like all the other nations. So when you look at Abraham's, the covenant God makes with Abraham, one of the things he says is kings and queens will come from your lineage. So we know that God's okay with kings and queens coming from them, but it's how they're going to want a king. And a few things happen that we need to talk about from the transition from a judge to a king. So they go to Samuel. What do we know about Samuel? Who is Samuel in Scripture? He's a prophet of God. He's also a judge, and Eli was a judge as well. So how did one get elected a judge over Israel? Was it on the second Tuesday of the month? They went into their polling places. How did one become a judge over Israel? They were divinely and directly chosen by God. So I want you to think about this. When the people come to Samuel, who is a judge, divinely appointed by God, and they say, we want a king, how do you think that makes Samuel feel? Okay? But they want a king like all the other nations. What do you think? Let's unpack that. Like all the other nations. What do you think that means? John, do you have any ideas? We want a king like everybody else.
So the king was the placeholder for the God that they had. Think of the pharaohs. You know, the pharaoh was God incarnate. The pharaoh was, to borrow a phrase, the image and the likeness of the God that they worshiped. And I think this is on, but it's not picking up, so I'll just speak up. So they're saying that we've already got problems with Israel wanting an engraven image, right? And wanting to follow gods, right? The idea of having somebody to lead them like the other nations did. Somebody who would go before them in battle like the other nations did. Somebody that they could see and touch. Have you ever felt that way yourself? It'd be really great if Jesus was still here. So I had somebody that I could see and touch and talk to. I don't think that's all that different from what is drawing Israel to want something that looks like the other nations have.
You make a good point. With the king would go out into battle and would be their leader. They would look to the king for what to do. But think about the battles that we see through Deuteronomy and through Joshua. I mean, they would go into battle and completely annihilate nations, take them out. And, oh, by the way, Joshua just says, I need more time. Can you make the sun stand still? And God says, yes. I mean, you got stuff like this happening, or when we talked about Moses raising his arms, as long as his arms were raised, the Lord was their banner, right? And they're winning. But for whatever reason, I mean, go back and read the book of Judges if you want to be depressed today. I mean, it's one of those books. It's just like this. And Judges 21, I think verse 25 says, at that time there was no king. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. By the way, you're probably going to see a lot of parallels between the sermon this morning and what we're talking about today. So another way to say everyone did what was right in their own eyes is everyone did what they thought was righteous, what they thought was right. And so we see this pattern developing where they're not looking to God, they're looking to everybody else, seeing what they're doing and saying, we want that. Does that sound familiar? All right, as I said, when we do what is right in our own eyes, righteousness becomes relative. We look at this and go, well, that's a good suggestion, but I like this. And we rewrite the Bible or just don't even go by the Bible to say what we want it to say. So there's a problem there. You have these judges divinely appointed by God who are making these rulings for the people, but they don't want that. And so by the time we get to 2 Samuel, we see that God, in essence, has gone on a self-imposed exile. Rather than sending the people away, he's taken himself away. How do we know that? Well, what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 6? What comes back? All you got to do is read the heading at the top. The Ark of the Covenant, right? And the Ark of the Covenant was in the tabernacle. It eventually will be in the temple, and it represents the presence of God. And between those cherubs was a mercy seat, and that is where God's presence would sit, right? Think about this. Israel has lost the presence of God. The Philistines capture it. Philistines give it back because they're getting all kinds of tumors and things. They don't want it. They finally send it back. But in 2 Samuel chapter 6, we see the ark being brought back to Jerusalem, and God is also going to show that this is the place where he's going to build his temple. So the presence of God is coming back. And now in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we see this promise that is given to David. It's pretty lengthy. Let me read a little bit of it, though. The first section is about what God says he will do. And the second section of 2 Samuel 7 is David's response to what God says he will do. So let's read some of this. 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in a house of cedar while the ark of God remains in a tent." And Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." Now, something we're going to see here is a lot of times even the prophets have to go consort with God, because right now Nathan's like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. God is going to tell Nathan, no, that's not a great idea. Not for David anyway, okay? But that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I was brought Israel up out of Egypt to this day. I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling, wherever I may have moved with all the Israelites. Did I ever say to any of the rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all of your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning and have done ever since that time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you will rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, the floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So he reports this all to David, and David gives an answer which I think is a great answer. Who am I? Who am I that the Lord would do this for me? Who am I that God would establish such a covenant with me? And so what are some of the things that God promises in this covenant to David? What's that?
Permanence.
Permanence, right? You're going to have a lineage that goes on forever and ever. Okay? And if you're a king, isn't that what you want to hear? That it's going to be your bloodline that is carried on from generation to generation. And there's different language that he's using in here that we see in covenants around the Near East and the Canaanites during that time. Did you notice the father-son language? He says, I will be your father and you will be my son. This was often in other treaties they found throughout the world. This is what the king would say to his people. I will be like the father, you will be like the son. But there's a big difference that you might miss it if you don't look hard, is that even though God is setting up a king, he always has a direct way to get to that king. So the way the author says this in the book, for every David, there needs to be a Nathan. I like that. For every David, there needs to be a Nathan. And we see in the book of Esther, you had to have permission to come into the presence of the king, right? And if you came into the presence of king and you didn't have permission, what could happen? You could be put to death. One of the benefits that Nathan the prophet's going to have, or whoever the prophet is to the king, is they can come and speak to the king anytime they want because they are the mouthpiece of God. So it kind of puts the king in check a little bit, right? So when David commits adultery with Bathsheba, who is the one that calls him out for his sin? It's Nathan who comes in. We have that story about, hey, there's this guy that had all kinds of sheep over here, anything he wanted, and then his next door neighbor had one sheep. That's all he had, but the next door neighbor wanted that one sheep, and he took it. What should happen? And David said, that guy should be brought to an end. And he said, well, you're that guy. I mean, who else could say that to a king and live? So for every David, there needs to be a Nathan. For every king of Israel, or later on Judah, there needs to be a prophet, and God will have a mouthpiece to talk to them. But you also have this father-son language, and I'm going to set this up before I let John take over here. In the book of, well, let me talk about this first as well. In this whole promise, the word house, there's kind of a play on words there. As they are talking about house, David is saying, I want to build God a house. But it's not just a house. What is it supposed to be? It's going to be the sanctuary, the place where he resides. And then God tells David, no, I want to build you a house. But David already has a palace. So the word house here, when David is saying, God is saying to David, I want to build you a house. He's talking about this lineage. I want to build you a lasting line. I want to build you a family that will last. And so that's in the promise. Now we know, he also says, hey, as long as you follow me, you will never fail to have somebody sitting on the throne. How long does this kingdom, as David knows it, last? Well, through Solomon, and then it's ripped away, right? This is why Jesus is so important. And this is why genealogies are so important, because when you look in Matthew, who is in Jesus' genealogy? Say that 5 times fast. David. So God is keeping his promise. It might not be the way that the people of Israel saw it, but God is going to keep his promise. So you have this idea of a house being established, a house for God and a house for David. But this father-son language, let me come back to this. Because Jesus is not going to be the first person to be called a son of God. Back in this Near Eastern, when you look at this history and you find these, I want to say scripts, that's not right. When you find all these, not artifacts either. What do they find that people write on?
Tablets.
Scrolls, tablets, those kind of things, right? When they found all these in the ancient Near East around the Canaanites, they had words for their kings. And one of the things they would call their king is a son of God, because the king was to take on the characteristics of their God. We see this also in Roman times. They took it a step further. They believed that the emperor actually was a god. But the king was to be the one who bared the image and the likeness of their God. For instance, there's a guy in 1 Kings 15, 18 and 20 by the name of Ben-Hadad. We've read about him before. Ben-Hadad, the word Ben in Hebrew means son. All right, so we have the name Benjamin, that's son of my right hand. I always remember that one because my son is Benjamin. Son of my right hand. Hadad is another way of saying Baal or Baal. So when we look at Ben-Hadad in 1 Kings chapter 15, he is a son of God or a son of his gods. And so when everything fails, we go back to this covenant, and we now will have a king many years later, and I don't want to trample on all that John's going to talk about next week. We're going to have a king who is the son of God and definitely carries his image and his likeness. And I also think that this is one of the reasons, even though David was not perfect, he was called a man after God's own heart. He was a son who bared the image of his father.
There's a lot in this also talking about just the general idea. You know, we kind of think of the new covenant, right? Jesus comes and the old is done and the new is here. And, you know, all the stuff in the old law is kind of done away with, and we get this, you know, the slate is clean and we start over. Not really. Remember, the promise to David is that his kingdom is going to go on forever. So the kingdom that David has is going on forever through Christ. So that must mean that the kingdom that David had is the kingdom that we are part of today. Does that make sense? It was explained a little bit differently, but it was still God's kingdom. We are still God's people. We are still God's image and God's likeness. That hasn't changed. David wasn't able to do all that needed to be done. The people weren't all that they needed to be, and they could not be righteous on their own.
Can I throw this in real quick? Because it's one of my favorite parts. I forgot to talk about it. Turn to Deuteronomy 17 real quick. And this is great to study during class after we just talked about Josiah. Because the law had been lost, and now it's been found. But notice what it says in Deuteronomy 17. Not only the part where it says you'll ask for a king, and this you should choose a king that I will appoint. I want to start in verse 18. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law taken from that of the Levitical priest. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So God says every king shall make a copy for themselves. Now, I don't know if this means ask a scribe to do it or write it down himself. But they are to make a copy. They are to have that Torah with them all the time. And they are to read that Torah every day. Why do you think Josiah tore his robes? He read that. He said, are you telling me I'm supposed to have my own copy and I'm supposed to know it and I'm supposed to read it every day? At some point down the road, the kings just threw out the law. And so, yes, there is going to be a king over Israel, but it's like a vassal king. There is always a king higher than he. Okay.
So we haven't grown up with a king in America. We kind of got rid of that, right? Threw a bunch of tea in the harbor and chose something different. So we've kind of lost our chops on understanding what kings mean and where they come from and how it works. We can look at it and go, well, they own all kinds of stuff and people pay them taxes, and eventually they marry somebody and then somehow somebody gets their head cut off. That's the way it normally ends, right? So let me try to bridge from something that you kind of know to something that you don't maybe know. And let me ask this question. What is the church, what is the primary church in England? The Church of England. It's also called the Anglican Church. Who is the head of the Anglican Church? The Queen. I need you to think about that for a second. The Queen is the head of the Anglican Church. Who is going back to what Darrel just said, who is the Nathan for the Queen of England? Archbishop of Canterbury. He's the head of the church. So how did Elizabeth physically become the head of the Anglican Church? When did that happen? During her ascension, right? That's why we call it an ascension. She goes from not only becoming the monarch, but she becomes and it's a word that starts with S, sovereign. Isn't that interesting? Kind of weird, isn't it? David is what? He's the sovereign. So, actually, the Church of England kind of goes back, all the kings and the idea of having a king taking on a head of a religion actually goes back to the Davidic line. Their genealogies are a little messy, I'm sure, but they kind of go back to that same idea. So, how does this all, I want you to think about that's kind of the role that David took, he was the head of what style of government? Was it a democracy? Was it a monarchy? What else was it? What was Israel? A theocracy. So David is the head of a theocratic government, which makes him a sovereign. Okay, does this help a little bit, starting to kind of think through that? I want to read a little bit to kind of give you some context from the book. He says, and this is just one paragraph, I'm going to read a little bit more later. He says, the ancient Near Eastern and Canaanite cultural context is significant. In Egypt, from at least 1650 BC and onward, people perceived, as Darrel said, people perceived the king as the image of God because he was the Son of God. The emphasis was not on physical appearance. For example, a male king could be the image of a female goddess. What is stressed is that the behavior of the king reflects the behavior of the God. The king, as the image of God, reflects the characteristics and essential notions of that God. Do you remember when we were talking about Adam? God made Adam and Eve in the what? Image and likeness. I'm going to go back to this. We only have one more week after this, so I only have to do this one more time. Tell me again, what is the image? We had a fun little thing that we said. You know what? He is the spitting image of his Father. And what does that convey? He looks like him, it reminds of him, but it also deals with where he gets his authority, right? Who he's part of, who's over him, what he's going to inherit, what he's sharing in. That's all image language. And then over in likeness, what was the thing that we did for likeness? They act and speak. You are just like your Father. That could be good or bad, or both, right? That means that it acts in a certain way. That's how they take that image and they interact with the people around. So why is this important? Because in many ways, jumping to the very end of class, in very many ways, all of us as a priesthood, all of us as Christians, as members of God's kingdom through Christ, have been made in the image and in the likeness of God. We have all of the authority that's given us by being God's people, and we are to live in a certain way that points people where? To God. So what was the job, if you were to nail it down to one or two sentences, what was the job of Israel as a nation? To point people to God, to be a light on a hill, to show the nations what it meant to live in the humanness that God intended for his people that he created. Now, you made an interesting comment. Ben-Hadad, son of Baal, of gods. What would be different between having a son of Baal and a son of Yahweh? Does the son of Baal have authority over the people of Yahweh from some different land? I mean, they militarily maybe. Is God one of the gods or is God the God? So David, as being a son of God, isn't claiming to be the son of a God. He is, in fact, it says in Deuteronomy, you are exalted above all of the nations, because he is a son of the God, the Creator, the Elohim. Does that make sense? So where we might today say, well, I'm a Christian and maybe you're not. I believe in God and I know you, maybe you don't. In this language that David is dealing with, he's going, I am the representative. I am the image and the likeness. Israel should have been able to say, we are the image and the likeness of Elohim, the creator of all. And we should be showing the world how to live, who God is, his character, his Torah, his law. We should be able to show the world the wisdom of God the Creator. That was David's job, that was Israel's job, and we're going to find that that's our job. I want to read a little bit more out of the book quickly, if I can. I'm going to read quickly with my glasses on because that works better. Talking about Israel, he says in 2 Samuel 7, we must also be read. 2 Samuel 7 must also be read according to the arrangement of the books in the Hebrew canon. So a reading of this canon indicates that the Davidic king is inheriting the role of both Adam as son of God and Israel as son of God, according to the instructions of Deuteronomy 17. This can basically be reviewed and summarized at this point. So first, to be considered is the fact that humans are created as the divine image, according to Genesis 1:26 through 28. The divine image defines humans in terms of covenant relationship with the Creator God on the one hand, and with the creation on the other hand. So loving God and our neighbors. The former may be captured by the term sonship and is implied in Genesis 5:1 through 3. The latter relationship, i.e. between humans and the creation, may be reflected in the term kingship and servanthood. Earlier in the class, we noted in the 9th century BC, there is an inscription, I think that was the word you were looking for, an inscription or an image that refers to the king's majestic self and power in relation to his subjects, while likeness refers to the king's petitionary role and relation to the deity. The ancient Near Eastern data confirms and corresponds exactly to this in the biblical text. As Genesis 2:4 through 25 shows, and he uses the term the Endemic Son. In other words, Adam as a son is like a priest in the garden sanctuary. Remember how we talked about that? He took care of the garden. He was a caretaker, kind of like the priests in the temple. So Adam takes care of the garden. He must first learn the ways of God in order to exercise the rule of God as God himself would. I'm telling you that the same role that Adam had in the garden is the same role that all of us have today in this kingdom, which is to spend our time understanding God's rule, understanding who he is, and then sharing that or manifesting that in the world around us. Second, Israel inherited this Edemic role. Yahweh refers to the nations as his son in Exodus 4:22 and 23. The divine purpose in the covenant established between God and Israel at Sinai is unfolded in Exodus 19:3 through 6. As a kingdom of priests, they will function to make the ways of God known to the nations and also bring the nations into a right relationship with God. Since Israel is located geographically on the one and only communications link between the great superpowers of the ancient world, in this position she will show the nations how to have a right relationship with God, how to treat each other in a truly human way, and how to be faithful stewards of the earth. This is the meaning of Israel's sonship. And then third and last, in Deuteronomy 17, it shows us that the king will be the leader of this role. In verses 16 through 20, it describes the manner in which the future king is to exercise his responsibilities. After 3 negative commands, do anybody remember what the 3 things that the king is not supposed to do? The king gets 6 commands that are unique to the king. 3 things he's supposed to do, 3 things he's not. Not to have chariots and horses. Not to intermarry foreign women. Gets you every time. Anybody else? Yes. Yeah, don't make yourself wealthy.
Study I learned was the only prophet to be appointed judge. So as we think about setting up David's lineage, I feel like that was a prequel, Samuel and God, to setting David up. And, as you read through Samuel, it's Samuel judged, Samuel did this. So I don't want to leave Samuel out of the lineage. It's like, if he was the only one to be appointed judge that we know of, that's a huge significance in setting up David's lineage. He was part of that.
Yeah, you look at Samuel as well during the life of Saul.
Yes.
He had a very big, he's basically the one that told Saul, wait till I get there before you go to battle, and all those kind of things. Now there were some, I think it says Deborah was a prophetess, so some of them had the gift of prophecy. but the way that a prophet to a specific person in authority, I think, is big. Yeah. Now, Eli is also a judge as well, but when you read about Eli and Samuel, it's not. When you start off with the story of Hannah, pretty good dude there. But then Eli, he's kind of like this lazy, fat old man that sits around, and his sons are, they're not doing what they're supposed to do, and, he falls over backwards in his chair and he dies when he finds it's a weird story, but, so he's supposed to be a judge too, but you don't see a lot of judgments there that he makes, but it's important. Go ahead.
So, we're going to see the three things that David is supposed to do, which is to basically write the law, keep the law, and make the law the thing that he shares, that he leads from. But we're also going to see David do the three things he's not supposed to do, right? And we started off with the Queen of England, Elizabeth, and she seems to be a really nice older lady, but she's also done all of the three things that she's not supposed to do, which is to assume wealth, accumulate wealth, build an army. She didn't intermarry. She was really pretty good on that. She stayed pretty true to, family. What I want you to ask the real simple question of is so what was, if you're thinking about the kingdom, I want you to just think big picture kingdom, and I'm talking everything from Genesis to Revelation. What was David's job?
Try to keep Israel online to worship God.
Keeping Israel online to worship God. Think through the two terms of image and likeness.
Preserve the, I don't know about preserve, but he was to establish that seed line to Jesus, make that connection.
Yep. He was supposed to be showing everybody who God was through the way that he lived. And he was supposed to be leading Israel to being a nation that showed the world God's justice and mercy. And in fact, we're going to see that culminate, if you want to see both the most wonderful and awful passage in the Bible, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's when the Queen of Sheba comes to Solomon and looks at all of the things that Solomon has done and all the things that God has done and the wonders of the nation of Israel that God through David built and culminated in Solomon. And she's going to say, surely your God is a God of justice and mercy. Every nation should look to Israel as to how it should live in this world. The passage after that says, and Solomon married foreign wives, and everything went downhill from there.
So that's why when you look at the life of David, what are the big strikes against David? What are the ones we always bring up? Things he did wrong. Bathsheba, murdering Uriah. There's one towards the end of his reign that we don't talk about as much. Counting the fighting men. Those are stories about a lack of holiness, but they're also stories about a lack of righteousness. Because the king is supposed to do what is just and what is right. So that when Israel looks at the king, they're supposed to see an example of God. So when David's committing adultery with Bathsheba and he has a man murdered and he counts the fighting men, it's not just about, he needs to be more pure. He needs to be more just. He needs to be more righteous because he represents the true king. And that's what makes Jesus all the better. So,
where we're going to go next week is we're going to look at how Jesus is going to fulfill what David was unable to fulfill. David was a good king. He was human, and he makes mistakes, just like me. I haven't killed anybody recently, but we're all in this boat together, right? But what I really wanted you to see through this whole class and where we're going to land next Sunday is this idea that Jesus is going to come as a man, not as God. He's going to come as a man, and he's going to show us what it truly looks like to live as a son of God in the image and likeness. And he's going to show us what humanity really is supposed to look like, what our potential is to be if we live under a just and righteous God. So what I want you to see is it's one story. It's the same battle that Adam fought. It's the same battle that Moses fought. It's the same battle that David fought. And it's the same battle that you and I are going to fight today. And that is, will we live in the image and in the likeness of God? Will we take on the sonship that God has offered us in a world where we are supposed to show the world the righteousness and the justice and the wisdom of God our Creator?
Yeah, so we've been talking about one covenant all through. Next week we start a new covenant. But I don't want us to think they're connected. I don't want to jump all over what John's going to say next week. But Jesus offers a new covenant through his blood. He's going to make the covenant possible through the salvation that he brings. So we will look at Jesus and that new covenant next week. I'm going to be gone, but John's going to wrap it up for us. And then 2 weeks, we're going to have a new class started by Jeff Peters and Brandon Haney about followership. So if you don't want to follow, leave before that class starts. Or no, I'm just kidding. But we'll go ahead and quit here. But thank you guys for being here.
All right, thanks.